Hi, everyone. Hello. Um, Hello, welcome to the Menil Drawing Institute. My name is Mary Magsman. I'm the Public Programs Manager here and thrilled to be welcoming you all here tonight for our talk by Kyle Chayka on minimalism between art and life. I want to tell you about our next public program, which is this Saturday night. It's going to be in the main building, and it's a co-presentation with Imprint, and it's a Ukrainian author named Andrei Kurkov, and he's going to be talking about a new book he has called Gray Bees. So tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome Kyle Chayka and to do his talk here that is in correspondence with the exhibition, The Hanne Darboven Show, that Kelly Montana curated. And Kyle is a staff writer for The New Yorker, covering technology and culture on the internet. His work has appeared in The New Republic, The New York Times Magazine, Harper's Magazine, and others. His first nonfiction book, Longing for Less, Living with Minimalism, was published in 2020, and it will be released soon in paperback in January. And if you'd like to get a copy of this that has been signed, we're selling them in the Menil bookstore. So Christmas present idea for anybody still trying to figure that out. His second book is called Filterworld, How Algorithms Flatten Culture, and that's going to be published by Doubleday on January 16th, so you can also check that out. Thinking of minimalism and how to talk about minimalism, Kyle came up as a really interesting person, with all these ideas that are going around about minimalism in our life and in art. And so I was really excited that he agreed to come here and talk about these viewpoints. And if you haven't seen the Hanne Darboven exhibition yet, it is up until February 11th, so I encourage you to see it. So please welcome Kyle Chayka.
Thank you all for coming to this. It's really cool to see so many people. The Hanne Darboven show is super cool. I think what I wanted to do with this talk was kind of give one context to see it in, and kind of one way to think about what her work is and how she works as an artist. So it's not just about Hanne Darboven, it's not just about art even, but it's kind of like what I thought of around this show and how you might approach it. So I think, minimalism as a word, I think I started to at least hear it and see it everywhere around 2015, 2016, or even earlier than that. It was kind of a cliche almost, like you could have minimalist skincare, you could have a minimalist restaurant, you could have a minimalist fashion, you could have kind of minimalist anything. And the minimalist look, I feel like, always looked something like this. And this is a real house of a real person. It is not a computer rendering. It is the Long Island home of Leah Chavez, who is an artist and also the partner of a guy named Shingy, who, if you don't know, was the futurist of AOL for a few infamous years in the 2010s. But you can see it's just this kind of like total white void. The floor is white, the walls are white, even the beams are white. And it just looks like a place that no human being could ever inhabit. Like I cannot imagine setting foot inside this place because I feel like I would ruin it. I would destroy it with my humanity. And I just thought it was very strange how this was becoming kind of the aspirational cliche of interior design and dwelling almost. And it kind of existed in this context of minimalist products. We all probably saw the Marie Kondo book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, which advocated getting rid of everything in your space. And not coincidentally, I think she suggested only owning 10 books or something, which I really don't agree with. But you also had products like Glossier, we can look at the zoom in, minimalist skincare. You had minimalist influencers like this guy. And you can kind of see this like minimalist lifestyle evolving. It's a lifestyle in which you sleep in this low flat bed in an industrial loft with your hanging pendant lamps and look in your full-length mirror and gaze out your floor-to-ceiling windows. You might sit in your fake reproduction Eames chair that you bought on Amazon for $100. You might hang out with your fake Noguchi rice paper lamps. You might wear a capsule wardrobe that you found on Instagram that's like all monochrome beige. You might organize your kitchen into a series of minimalist boxes. So it was funny to witness this kind of lifestyle emerging. And the lifestyle seemed to take place in all of these generic loft condos. And I think you can see buildings like this popping up in almost any city. I live in Washington, D.C., and there are now entire neighborhoods that only consist of these like glass boxes. And I hear in Houston, so much construction is happening, and I'm sure a lot of it looks like this as well. And this was minimalist too. This was like living inside an industrial factory, except it was a newly made factory. It wasn't even a real factory. It was fetishizing like huge stretches of empty space and atriums in these apartments, like this one down here. And I mean, this was partly like evidence of gentrification. It was partly this like almost aesthetic invasion of minimalism into neighborhoods that otherwise didn't look like this. But it was always interesting to me that this was kind of the aspirational cliche. This was the lifestyle that a lot of people were aspiring to. And it went under this label of minimalism. And of course, Instagram was maybe the greatest perpetrator of this trend of minimalism. You can see here there's an account that's just named minimalism with over 500,000 followers. The hashtag minimalism has over 28 million posts. And you can kind of see the cliche of minimalism as it develops in these digital spaces. It's this like wash of pastel colors, big empty spaces, vaguely industrial rooms. You can see the classic Eames lounge chair down here, which like whenever you see an Eames lounge chair, you know you're in a minimalist space somehow these days. And I think, I mean, digital spaces provided this home for minimalism in a really interesting way. Partly to me, minimalism is this vocabulary that works very well in white space, which is something that we'll get into. But Instagram itself was kind of a white space. Like suddenly we had on our phones this like blank void that we had to fill with stuff. And these kinds of imagery really worked well in that blank space. But minimalism itself did not always look like that. Like I studied art history. I kind of started as a writer doing art criticism. And what I associated with minimalism was not the empty loft condo or the Eames chair or the like pastel nature photos, but stuff more like this. So this is a Donald Judd sculpture installed in one of his spaces in Marfa, Texas, which I think is a 9-hour drive from here or something. But this is like a different kind of minimalism. This was artistic minimalism, what I started to call capital M minimalism, which started in the 1960s as a specific art movement, as something that had like a grounding in a specific place with a specific set of people and had specific aesthetic values before it kind of distributed itself everywhere at once. And the minimalists were not just like, they didn't just look like clean, austere, white, empty boxes. It was kind of like aggressive industrial aesthetics. You had artists like Dan Flavin here working with fluorescent lights and like adopting that industrial material as his art, mounting it on the wall and arranging it in these different shapes. And you had Yayoi Kusama here, which I mean, Yayoi Kusama is now very much known for her infinity rooms, the kind of like Instagram-friendly, infinitely reflective boxes that now have long lines outside of them. But in the 1960s, she was doing sculptures that were more like this, which were, chairs and different kinds of furniture covered in these like bulbous phallic shapes. And this was minimalism too at that time. The term minimalism was actually coined in 1965 by this British art theorist named Richard Wollheim. And he wrote in this essay that minimalist art was art that had minimal art content, which I always thought was a very funny phrase. It was like art that didn't have art in it. And I think you can kind of see that in the Judd box. Like, this is an artwork that doesn't look like an artwork. If you saw it in a different context, or if you just saw it outside, you might not think of it as a sculpture. But it was made as a sculpture. It was made as a specific aesthetic experience. And that was kind of one of the radical leaps that Richard Wollheim was observing in all of these artists, was that they would make art that was defined not by like an extravagant swoop of paint or a realistic image of a specific scene, but instead was like a series of choices that they made about shape or form or adopting one material versus another. So the like art content of these things was not about the artist expressing some kind of emotion, like abstract expressionism, or speaking to some kind of like spiritual transcendence, but instead it was like making these kind of like abstract aesthetic decisions, recontextualizing forms and materials that you didn't normally think of as art. So in the case of Dan Flavin, like you see a fluorescent light on the wall here, like you see it as lighting. But if he puts it on the wall at this angle and kind of arranges it in different colors and shapes, then maybe we can start to see the light in a different way, to see that like industrial product become a sculpture. I love seeing these two images together, because on the left you have a Donald Judd aluminum box installed in his loft in Soho, which we'll talk about as well. And on the right you obviously have Michelangelo's Pietà. And I think, I mean, these look so totally different. Like one is totally austere. It doesn't seem to have any meaning. It doesn't like speak to you about tragedy or spirituality or death. And the other obviously does. It's this like classical, traditional piece. But in the end, I think we're meant to interact with them in the same way. Like, these are two sets of artistic decisions that have been made in a specific material that give the viewer a thing to respond to and a thing to interact with. So for Judd, you walking around, like the viewer walking around this metal box, was meant to be just as impactful as someone walking around the Pietà. And I think, I mean, that's kind of up to your taste. Like, you don't have to agree with that. But aesthetically, they were meant to function in the same way. And Judd used this term for his work, specific objects. And I think that points to something really interesting, which is just that it was a unique thing that existed, that an artist had made. And the act of putting it in a gallery, of telling you that it's art, is in a way what made it art. So on here we have some quotes. Donald Judd originally worked as an art critic, and he was a very vociferous, like stentorian art critic, and he thought he knew how everyone should make art. But I love his very aphoristic quotes. So in this one piece, he said, "A work needs only to be interesting." And that's just like, a thing has to give you an aesthetic experience. It has to tell you something about your body in relation to the metal box. It tells you something about an interior versus an exterior. It just has to like do something to you. And later in that review, he says, "It isn't necessary for a work to have a lot of things to look at, to compare, to analyze one by one, to contemplate. The thing as a whole, its quality as a whole, is what is interesting." there's another quote of his that I really like, that's something like, maybe a lot of red is better than 3 colors, which is like, I feel like the ultimate, it speaks to that decision making, that he's like, oh, you could have a lot of colors, you could make a realistic scene, but what if you just had a lot of red? Like, what if you just had an aluminum box and that was it? Like, that was the art. And I think that was a very, very radical act at that time. And I think it remains radical in a lot of ways. Like, this aluminum box is not most people's ideas of art still. It's kind of like cold and unfeeling. But I think when you go see it, when you experience it, and kind of like let yourself be involved in the aesthetic pleasure of like moving around this box, then you kind of like get a feeling. And I think that kind of feeling from abstraction is what minimalism is about. And minimalism also benefited from this rise of gallery architecture, which you can see here, but you can also see all around you. And this was the white cube. So it's a kind of cliche of gallery and museum architecture now. We look at art and we see it in these like totally empty white spaces. And that's meant to serve the art and kind of give us the best possible experience. But that kind of vocabulary was just emerging in the 50s and 60s. And so you had an artist and writer named Brian O'Doherty, who came up with this like coinage of the white cube, and that was in 1976. And I think the white cube does something very special for minimalist art. It kind of tells you that it's art. Like, I had this experience once of walking along Bowery in New York City and seeing this discarded piece of air conditioning duct on a pile of trash. And this was like, a perfect rectangular prism of metal, and otherwise it could be a Donald Judd. Like, if you stuck it on a wall, it would be a Donald Judd, but it was trash because it was on the trash. I really considered like bringing it home and attaching it to the wall and being like, here's my Donald Judd. Like, you can relate to it as a sculpture. But when you're in a white cube, when you're in a space like this, it kind of tells you that the thing that you're looking at is art, that you're supposed to consider it as art. It creates this like aesthetic reminder that you should take it seriously, not just as a piece of trash, but as something that someone made and put a lot of decision making into. And I think in that way, it really functions, this like white cube gallery functions like a gilded frame would have in the 19th century. The white cube conveys importance on an object. It tells you that this matters, you should focus on it, you should like think through what it's doing to you. And I think in terms of the mainstreaming of minimalism, like this white cube era in the 60s and 70s kind of kickstarted this aesthetic trend that has almost gotten out of hand. The white cube started in galleries and museums. It rapidly expanded into fashion boutiques and apartments and kind of like almost any space. So in this case, you can see this is a Chanel pop-up. And you see that there's like Chanel clothes on the rack in this kind of like blank, empty white cube industrial space. And the white cube, again, conveys importance on the object that's in it. But in this case, rather than like a radical work of art, it's a bunch of clothes, which are already commodified and already kind of fetishized. So in this, you can see like the strategy of minimalism being used toward this more commercial end. And I think it reaches a height or a kind of like joke in the Prada Marfa, which is an elm green and drag set installation that probably many of you know outside of Marfa. And this was built in 2005. And it's a Prada store, but it's also a sculpture because it's never open. You can't go inside, you can't buy anything. It just exists as this like monument to a particular aesthetic. And it's very funny. I mean, I feel like when you go up to it, the kind of funniest experience I had with it was going up and seeing how full of dead flies it is. Like it's this fossilized, cold totally dead aesthetic. So maybe we could see it as like a gravestone of minimalism. Or we could see this as the gravestone of minimalism, I suppose. I think, so in the white cube, anything in the white cube is kind of, has the status of art conveyed upon it. The white cube tells you to see something as art, it tells you to experience something as art, and like adopt it into your aesthetic world. So in the case of the apartment over here, like the white cube is saying, oh, all of these books and this fig leaf are the art. Like anything in this space is art. This is rarefied. And then you can look over here in Kim Kardashian and Kanye West's house and see it's this like total gray void. Like I feel like this is a gray cube actually. And the work of art that we're meant to be focusing on is probably Kim Kardashian in this case. And I think like you can see in this image too, some of the vocabulary of minimalism comes from like modernist architecture. It comes from the early 20th century, people like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. But they had an idea of living in these spaces. Like there was a functionalism to the spaces. There was an idea of a certain kind of lifestyle. But I think at this point, in the early 21st century, all elements of functionalism have been drained out of it. Like this is not a functional space. It's kind of empty space as empty space. It's empty space as a trophy. So in this, I think we see like how minimalism has become a lifestyle and like the aesthetic of minimalism has been adopted into this like luxury lifestyle. And in thinking about how like minimalism became life and life adopted the form of minimalism, I thought of these Robert Rauschenberg quotes. And Rauschenberg was not quite a minimalist, though he was working in the same era as artists like Donald Judd or Agnes Martin. He would use the kind of stuff of everyday life and recontextualize it as art. But he said, painting relates to both art and life. Neither can be made. I try to act in the gap between the two. And then he kind of restated that. You can't make either life or art. You have to work in the whole in between, which is undefined. And I think from those Rauschenberg quotes, this idea of working between art and life has really developed. Like you see these quotes cited over and over again. And I wanted to think a little bit about like, what is art versus what is life? I think life we think of as this like mundane experience. It's like our day-to-day. It's what we do, it's how we exist. Whereas art is supposed to be this transcendental thing. It's supposed to be the like magical, spiritual, ineffable thing that you make outside of life. But I think in a way you can see the minimalists merging those two things and moving between them a lot more than other artists did in the past. So I wanted to kind of think through the lifestyles of minimalist artists and like how they lived as much as how they made art. And here you have Donald Judd's loft in Soho. So in 1968, Judd bought this entire building at 101 Spring Street. And you may be jealous knowing that he bought it for $68,000. I think there was some Guggenheim grant money that went into it. But now it is, I think still is the only single family building in Soho. Clearly it was not built as residential architecture, like this was a factory. But he decided that this was going to be his home, and he bought it, he moved his small family into it. And he kind of like decided that this kind of industrial space would be an artistic lifestyle. Like I think he decided that this would be like a conducive space to the kind of art that he made and the kind of lifestyle that he wanted to have. You can see some of the interior of the loft here. And I really feel like in the 60s, Judd was inventing what we think of as the loft lifestyle. Like there were many people who were living in lofts and doing this kind of thing. Most of them didn't own entire buildings in Soho. And most of them, I think, didn't have quite the sensitivity to like domestic architecture that Judd did. So I love seeing this like these old shots of Judd in like the 70s, just kind of relaxing in this totally huge empty industrial space. You can see, I think, some, booze bottles on the floor. And he decided to live in the midst of this minimalist art. He decided to like live in this industrial space, aestheticize it, kind of incorporate both his work and life into one thing. And you can see, like, he's living with minimalist art. This is a Frank Stella over here. But he's also just living his normal life. Like, I love how this baby carriage in this context looks like a sculpture, even though it's not. It's just kind of there, both as an aesthetic thing and as a functional thing. And over here you can see the bedroom, which looks like, I don't know, every dwell spread now. Like this is what built the cliche of minimalist living and the loft lifestyle. Similarly, this like nice open kitchen, there's a deli slicer in the background here. But I think Judd was early on in like adopting this minimalist ethos of like industrial material and like aestheticizing everything into his lifestyle. And here you can see Judd's library in Marfa, Texas. And with this image, I always think about like the minimalist cliche is of an empty space, is of throwing all your stuff out like Marie Kondo. But Judd actually had tons of stuff. Like he would cover these tables with, every little artifact. There were like, arrowheads and cowboy hats, and every book that he was thinking about would just be sprawled out on the table. And I think about how, like, if any of us had this much space, if we had buildings and buildings of loft space, we could probably be pretty minimalist too. But this was, I think, Judd got tired of Manhattan living, even though he had an entire factory, I'm not sure, in 1971. So he started buying up property in Marfa, and how he found Marfa was he looked for the town in Texas that had the most empty space around it, that was the farthest from everything else, but still had good architecture. So he was like, oh, there's enough here, but there's also nothing here. And he started buying up buildings all over town. And similarly, Agnes Martin, who's a minimalist painter who paints like grids and stripes on these big square canvases, she similarly got tired of Manhattan and moved out to New Mexico in 1968. And she constructed this other lifestyle for herself as well. She built her own tiny cabin. She lived in this very aesthetic way. And I think that kind of distance from civilization and the space of the desert and that way of like building your own life really informed her work. It was a kind of intermingling of the living and the art making, or the integration of the two. But funnily enough, more recently, after her death in 2004, her home was put up for sale on Sotheby's for just under $600,000. But it was so funny to me to see like this kind of transcendental space of her art making transformed into like a commodified real estate listing that you could see anywhere. But it still looks good. Like, I feel like I would live in this space. Another minimalist artist, though not quite a visual artist always, is John Cage. So Cage was a composer famous for his 4:33 piece, in which he did not play the piano for 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and kind of let everyone experience the sounds that were around them. But he lived with his partner, the choreographer Merce Cunningham, in a loft on 18th Street in Manhattan. They moved there in 1978. And here you can see like another kind of vocabulary of loft living and the like stuff of art and life intermingling, like the plants crawling all over and this very bright light and space. And I always remember this anecdote about John Cage. While he was living in this loft, he had guests over one night, so as he often did. but there was a fire alarm going on in the hallway that was just broken, so it was beeping all night long. And then everyone wakes up the next morning and starts complaining about the noise. They couldn't get any sleep. But John Cage slept perfectly. He said, "I remained in bed, listened carefully to the alarm's pattern, and worked it into my thoughts and dreams, and I slept very well." So it was like a minimalist strategy of existing in the world, that he could hear this obnoxious noise, like the beeping in the hallway, and just kind of recontextualize it in his mind as an artistic thing, as an aesthetic experience, and not care about it. I mean, I think that's kind of like a Zen koan or something. Like, I don't know that he actually slept through it that well, but it makes for a nice demonstration of this value, which is like taking something that could be ugly or uncomfortable or displeasing or just unfamiliar, like a beep, like an aluminum box, like a fluorescent light, and like recontextualizing it as an aesthetic experience. And I think like minimalism, I think, is like a process often. It's a way of existing in the world. It's a way of like making life into art. And one artist who really did that was this performance artist, Chayka. And throughout his career, he did only a handful of major pieces, which were year-long performances. And they were all very regimented and very austere. So he would turn his life into the practice of art, I would say. And in this early one, he lived in a cage for an entire year. In another, he tied himself to another artist 24/7 for the length of a year. In another, he spent a year punching a card in this clock every hour. And then my favorite, which is possibly like the most minimalist piece of art ever, he spent a year not making any art. So from July 1985 to July 1986, he made nothing. He consciously didn't make art, and that was the art itself. So I like thinking about how he turns his life into art with these kind of regimented practices and like living very austerely. I mean, I don't think anyone aspires toward this kind of lifestyle, but I think it shows how you can think of your life in the living of it as an artistic act. Similarly, Onkawara, who I think you'll be able to see here at the Menil very soon, turned his life into art as well. So he would often send these telegrams to his art dealers and friends, and they just said, "I am still alive." So they were this demonstration of living and continuing to exist and continuing to make art. But the unit of the art making was the telegram. Like, this was his artistic gesture, to be still alive, to like send a symbol of his life to other people. And maybe his most famous series are these date paintings. And he would, for the span of many years, make, some days make one date painting, some days make several, and the entire thing was just this date on the canvas. It wasn't necessarily that day. It wasn't necessarily a significant day. It was just kind of marking time by making art. And I think that is kind of the way that all of these artists work. By existing in the world, by carrying out their life, they're also making art. And so I wanted to kind of apply these ideas to Hanne Darboven's work as well. And I think when I walk into the galleries over there, it's kind of an overwhelming experience, I think, because you quickly feel how obsessive Hanne Darboven was. You see these like minuscule squiggling lines, you see like the intense practice of her art making, and you see like the sheer scale of these installations. So you can see here, these are like her drawings and diagrams covering entire walls, entire rooms. And I think visually that just hits you right away. This is an intense practice. This is like very time intensive. This is like something that someone has committed their entire existence to. And Hanne saw herself as a writer, or she saw writing as her art, making all of these little like diagrams and lines and abstracted words. So similarly, like on Kawara, she's kind of making marks to show that she exists, I think, and to prove her existence in the world. Here you can see a photo of her studio, which was the home that she lived in for many decades. It's a family compound in Hamburg. And then here you can see kind of these little obsessive marks and letter writing. And I like just seeing the kind of like ambiance of the studio and the space in which she made all of her work. And here's some of her letters, which she would send to people like Solowit or other minimalist artists. From 1966 to 68, Hanne did live in New York City and kind of existed in the same milieu. So she was working and living in the same space as all of these minimalist artists. But then she also retreated. Like it's interesting, actually. A lot of these minimalist artists end up leaving their lives. They end up like resetting or seeking their own space in which to create an identity. So you can see Judd did that, Agnes Martin did that, Hanne Darboven did that. So when she moved away from New York, she moved back into this family compound. The Darboven family is actually famous, or they kind of made their wealth in Germany in a coffee company. So she lived in this very interesting, like old style house and compound. And she remained there for decades. She lived there with her mother. And Hanne would actually write letters to her mother even as they were staying in the same house. And this was kind of like life turning into art once more. She would write these effusive letters to her mother, thanking her mother for supporting her art-making practice, but also asking to be woken up at certain times, for example, so that she could continue this ineffable project of making these kinds of drawings and letters and like continuing the obsessive act of translating life into art. And I think here, this might even be a Solowit sculpture. But you can kind of see, in addition to like occupying all of the space, Hanne also collected all of these artifacts. So I wouldn't call her a hoarder necessarily, though I think I found one description of her as a very orderly hoarder. But I think she was driven to collect these things because they had some meaning for her, because she could like integrate them into her artistic practice, either by putting them in vitrines and including them in installations, or just by living among them. And I think that like practice of living is maybe the part that I find most interesting about it. Like the way that she made her work was to be among all of this stuff, was to collect it. And even though it looks like a huge mess, kind of like there's tons of stuff in here, it's still a kind of, the output of her practice is very minimalist. It's very ordered and intentional. It's like a careful curation or recontextualization of all of these objects into new artistic works. And here you can see a few more images of her home and studio. And these are by the photographer Julia Geisbacher. I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but you can kind of see the arrangement of things in space, these like mannequins and furniture and strange artifacts. So in a way, I think, even though it doesn't look like Donald Judd's domestic spaces, it kind of functions in the same way. Like this is being in the inside of someone's brain, inside the artist's brain. Like the life, in a way, is inseparable from the art, which I think is not always the case. And I think the figure of the artist herself is like part of maybe that's what connects the life and the art. Like the artist is both living and making their art. But you can kind of see how Hanne Darboven was very conscious of her image. She's like perfectly holding this cigarette and staring at the camera and wearing these fashionable outfits like a kind of vintage bureaucrat or something. But what these images remind me of is the way that artists have kind of always aestheticized their life. Like they've seen themselves as aesthetic actors in the world. They've presented themselves as characters and like used themselves as characters to contextualize their work in a certain way, to create a narrative around themselves. But I think what the way we live now has done is kind of force us all to aestheticize our life in a way, and turn the materials of our life into art, to consider what's around us as art. In like looking at these portraits, I was really reminded of this like slogan of TikTok, which goes, "Romanticize your life." And when you see it on TikTok, it's this kind of like, it's tagged on all these montages of like vacations in France or cool nights out in New York City, or just like laying around your apartment. And I think what that act is, it's a kind of minimalist act to point your iPhone around your apartment, capture what's around you, and then broadcast that to the world as art, like to show your life off as a piece of art. And I think that's kind of like a lesson that the minimalist artists both developed and like pioneered for us. Like they showed us a way to live life as art, to move between life and art more quickly. So I want to go back to this collision, to this image. I think like Judd and others showed us that your home could be art, your furniture could be art, you could live in a way that was art, move back and forth between art and life. And even though something might not look like art, even though the aluminum box doesn't look like art, even though you don't think it's an aesthetic experience, everything around you is an aesthetic experience. Your day-to-day life, your existence in the world, your like continual marking of time is an aesthetic thing, can be art, even if it doesn't look like Michelangelo's Pietà. And for me, the other key to this process of transforming life into art is the iPhone camera and kind of the way that we broadcast ourselves online and frame ourselves constantly with our phones. So that's like pointing a selfie stick at yourself, or putting a particular Instagram on the feed, or choosing what to photograph. These are all ways that we kind of frame our day-to-day aesthetic experience, and recast ourselves as the art object in all of these spaces that we inhabit today. So I think that's kind of what I wanted to talk about with minimalism and Hanne Darboven. I feel like minimalism is this thing that's like everyone has an opinion about, I think. A lot of people tell me, oh, I could never be a minimalist. Like I couldn't throw out all of my stuff. But I always think that minimalism is not about living in an empty space or a full space, or collecting a certain kind of thing or not collecting things. But really it's about like experiencing the world in a different way and choosing to appreciate the aesthetic experiences around us and choosing to like value life as art maybe. So I think you can be minimalist and kind of have a minimalist practice of living and a kind of day-to-day meditative act wherever you are, whatever your apartment looks like, whatever furniture you buy, whatever fashion you wear. And that to me is kind of the inspirational thing about all of these artists and all of these ideas, is that you don't even have to make art per se. You can kind of adopt them into your own mindset and use them as tools to experience the world yourself. And I wanted to kind of close with a bit of a joke, but you remember the cage alarm incident. I was thinking of that last night because I was staying at Hotel Zaza around the corner, and my room is on a corner kind of facing the street. And at 3:30 a.m., the beeping started. It turned out that my room was just a few floors above the giant dumpsters that were getting cleared out by garbage trucks that evening. And when I woke up the first time at 3:30 or 4 or whatever, the beeping was going. It was this like consistent beeping. And the first thing I thought of was John Cage. I was like, in this case, what would John Cage do? He would try to hear this beeping as art and like not hear it as something ugly or bad or disruptive, but instead like live with it and think through it. And I did try to do that. I don't think it worked very well. I'm not quite as minimalist as he is. But yeah, it was like a way to adopt that practice into my own life. But yeah, I would love to like have more of a discussion about all these ideas, like hear what anyone is thinking about this stuff, whether it's Marie Kondo or Instagram or literally anything. I love like having this conversation.
All right. So I have a mic here. Want to take a couple questions?
Yeah, thank you. Music went through its own big M minimalism in about the same time, the 60s, 70s. Music, of course, is not about objects. Do we consider the movements of minimalism and art and music to be more or less intertwined? You mentioned Cage a couple times. Were those people all, do you consider it one movement?
Yeah, I mean, Cage was interacting with these artists quite a bit, and they were all thinking through these ideas at one time. And I think in my book, at least, I talk about this other minimalist composer named Julius Eastman, who's like a really fascinating queer Black composer. But I think if you listen to his work from the kind of 70s, 80s, there's this like monumentality and almost sculptural quality to the repetition and to the like aggressiveness of the compositions. I wish I could play a clip of it right now, but he would often compose these pieces on 4 pianos at once. So we'd have 4 performers on 4 pianos, just kind of hammering chords over and over and over again. And the compositions looked a lot like Hanne Darboven's scripts almost, like they were just dashes and dots and symbols, like totally almost unreadable to the musicians who were performing them. But what, like when I listen to those compositions, what I'm reminded of is like Judd's Metal Boxes and the kind of like repetition, but also difference and the infinite patterns that arise out of like mostly sameness, but a little difference, repeating over and over and again. So yeah, I mean, in short, I think this was all one moment, and they were certainly all in conversation with each other.
Hi. I think my question with minimalism comes from a lot of the time when I interact with it, I get a big sense of spirituality coming through, and I wonder if that's just coming from seeing someone document their life so in such a regimented way, like with Hanne Darboven. And I wonder if that's just like my internal interpretation or many people's interpretation, or if it's part of like the artist's expression. I want to hear. I guess maybe it depends case by case, but.
It's a really interesting question. Like I think, I mean, on the one hand, like you can go artist by artist and think about what they meant with their work. So I think Judd, for one, would say, no, there's like no transcendent spirituality to this. There's no like, I'm not trying to get to something ineffable. I'm actually trying to like ground you in reality and just make you experience the color red or this box. But then you can look at someone like Agnes Martin, whose life was very disciplined and who made very disciplined, patterned, repetitive paintings. And she talked about transcendence all the time. Like she wrote this kind of beautiful abstract poetry about how beautiful everything was and how she just aspired to like eternal happiness for everyone. But I think there's like, so that's on the artist side. I think you as the viewer can certainly take whatever you want from it too. Like I think there's a way in which experiencing minimalism is very spiritual and transcendent. And there's even minimalist qualities and like the practices of repetition in actual spiritual practice, like meditation. Another aspect of spirituality in this might be Zen. I mean, Zen Buddhism was just coming to the United States in the kind of 40s and 50s. So many of these artists, including John Cage, would go study with Zen Buddhists at Columbia and kind of think about religious practice as part of their work. So I think it's very intertwined.
Great presentation, thank you. Just a question, what would you think the classic minimalists would think about today's white boxes, the industrial spaces, commoditizing minimalism today?
I love that question. I mean, I think a lot of them would dislike it. Like, I think a lot of the generic condos, for example, or the loft architecture that you see now, it's almost minimalism just as a facade or as a trope or an archetype without it being an actual minimalist practice. Like for me, minimalism really rests in considering all the details, everything as part of a whole, really like thinking through the aesthetic experience of every part of something. And when I see like a new loft condo going up, like I don't think many of those have been wholly aesthetically considered. I think they're mostly devoted toward putting up as many apartments as possible, as cheaply as possible. But I think like, I mean, if we went back to that T magazine image. Sorry to go back through all this. Like, this is not an experience. Like, this is a void of experience. It's an empty space. There's nothing of interest in it, really. There's like a blank frame with nothing to frame, almost. I think Leah Chavez, the owner, talked about it as meditative and peaceful. But to me, it's like there's no aesthetic experience to have, almost, in this totally empty void. So for me, I would say, if you plunked a nice Agnes Martin in here, then it would be great. But not, like, without that, it just feels kind of dead and empty. And I think that's why some people feel minimalism today is oppressive or, kind of inaccessible, is because of that void-like quality that doesn't allow the human into it. Whereas I think when you see spaces like Judd's or even a lot of modernist architecture, it actually feels very human and very welcoming and very attuned to like your aesthetic experience of a space.
Thank you for that talk. I'll sneak a question in here. One thing that continues to fascinate me about Darboven's practice is the way that writing, you can think writing and drawing alongside each other and the way one slips into the other. And her letters that you showed are such a wonderful example of that. Like, correspondence is art, art is correspondence, art is life. And one thing I continue to be fascinated by in that sense is that you showed images of her in her home. And one thing I've thought a lot about how to reconcile and a lot about how to think about is how to think about like her minimalism as an artist and her kind of jokingly but also really kind of maximalism at home. And I'm curious if you can just think about her, but also in these other practices, like thinking about like minimalism and a kind of maximalism alongside each other, how one is like, is there like a complexity being masked or just thinking about them alongside each other and the way those can also slip into each other and feed and fuel each other.
Yeah. I mean, I've often thought about how they're two sides of the same coin. Like they kind of can't exist without each other. Like in this context, Hanne Darboven's work that you can see in the galleries, there's such a careful selection of what she has collected. There's like a sense of having a huge breadth of life and stuff and then narrowing it down to like the smallest possible experience. So the minimalism of that act of choice relies on the maximalism of, you know, being in that big house, of being surrounded by stuff and kind of feeling the weight of its history maybe. And I think, I mean, you can see the same with Judd's collecting, and I also think you can see the same with technology now too. I think there's a way in which the minimalism of something like an iPhone, which like we say is very minimalist and very austere, hides all the complexity that it relies on to exist. Like this iPhone relies on vast internet satellites and undersea cables and like aluminum mines in order to exist. So I feel like, I mean, minimalism relies on that like depth and accumulation of material often, I think. But then I think like when people talk about maximalism right now, it's this kind of all over explosion of color and pattern and visual interest. And in some ways, I think there's just a pendulum that swings between minimalism and maximalism in popular culture, where sometimes it's trendy to kind of decorate your walls with everything at once and have this like gallery aesthetic, or not like gallery wall aesthetic, I guess. And then other times it's more trendy to have this like white void. I do feel like if you ask someone right now what's trendy, it's not going to be this white void, but more something like Hanne Darboven's space, like something that has texture and feeling and like accumulation in life and life in it.
All right. Well, unless there's one more question, or
Oh, yeah, back here.
so, okay, we'll do one more question.
Hi, quick question. So you talked a lot about how minimalism creates an experience. So how do you think that a space influences a human's behavior?
It's a big one. I think, I mean, space and architecture gives you a context to exist in. Like, it gives you a role to play. It influences how you feel in a space. Like, I don't know, in a space like this with this interesting high ceiling and geometric facets, like, I feel like I can think more abstractly, or like I'm in a space that's not human or is not domestic, and I can kind of like think creatively or something. And it also makes me think of Gothic cathedrals, where light and space and the extreme emptiness of the ceiling was meant to evoke spirituality and transcendence and like the grand emptiness of God, maybe. But I think space has so much to do with how we behave at a given time. I think, I don't know, a lot of my writing has had to do with Airbnb over the years and how Airbnb kind of creates this marketplace of different spaces that you can inhabit at a moment's notice. And I've always enjoyed the way in which you can kind of surf Airbnb and decide what backdrop your life is going to take in that moment or that week. Like, I once rented a house in the Poconos with a bunch of college friends that was just like pure 70s, untouched, carpets in every room, including the bathrooms, like giant soaking tubs. There was like a hot tub inside, sunk in the floor. And there was something about that space that I think made us act a little differently. Like, it was a party house. It was like a space in which everyone could see each other and kind of like observe each other having fun. And I think that helped us like have more fun and almost role play the life that space suggested. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, thank you, Carl.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Kyle, for your talk.